Eyal Hulata is in Washington today for talks with its counterparts in the Biden administration on the Iran nuclear file. Now, with the negotiations in Vienna at a standstill, the White House is reportedly saying it is open to, quote, other avenues if they permanently break down. Now, as the Tehran regime ups the ante on its return to the nuclear talks, senior international affairs correspondent Owen Alterman takes a look at the risky strategy that Iran is now pursuing.
The cars pulled up. The diplomats walked in. The police stood guard at Vienna's Grand Hotel. And they haven't been there since, as talks over the Iran nuclear deal have been stalled since June 20th. Now, both Iran and the West are making noises about how and when to get back to the table. Iran now hinting at November. Both sides are after leverage.
America mistakenly assumes that it can make us desperate. But our resistance has worked, and will continue to work too. Smart and dynamic resistance of the Islamic Republic arises from its strategic wisdom.
And so the Iranian plan, find ways to avoid or live with U.S. sanctions, and in the meantime ramp up the nuclear program, enrich uranium to higher and higher levels, cut the breakout time to a nuclear bomb, push off those negotiations on a deal, imply that the West must make concessions, or Iran will simply walk away toward a nuclear weapons future.
This demands greater firmness from us. Iran cannot believe that time is on their side because the risks of a major crisis are rising as their nuclear program is becoming even more dangerous.
Iran's strategy comes with the risk, seen at a supermarket in Tehran, that economic hardship could make life difficult for the government, could weaken it, actually decreasing its leverage abroad.
Our children need to eat dairy products like milk and yogurt, but we see prices get more and more expensive every day. It's terrible. How is it possible to get by with these low salaries?
Iran is betting that its centrifuges are spinning so fast it will get both an advanced nuclear program and also sanctions relief to quiet its population. That's exactly the result Israel and the United States are signaling they want to prevent. It's not yet clear how.
Well, joining us now for more is Richard Goldberg, Senior Advisor for the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, speaking to us from Chicago. And Richard, thanks for joining us again. Now, we know that Iran is asking or asked the Biden administration to unfreeze some $10 billion in frozen funds in order as a condition for rejoining the talks. A report in Axios today that says the Biden administration, for now, is turning that idea down. What kind of strategy are we seeing playing out between Iran and the U.S. and, of course, the other signatories to the nuclear deal?
Well, what I think you're seeing right now, Calev, is a regime that is very comfortable with the status quo. Time was not on Iran's side on January 20th, 2021. The maximum pressure campaign had been ratcheted up to true maximum pressure. Iran was down to, as the IMF has told us, $4 billion in accessible exchange reserves. Censure resolutions were being passed in Vienna at the IAEA about Iran, not just its breach of its JCPOA limits, but its denial of inspectors and answering questions about undeclared nuclear activities and facilities. So Iran was really up against the wall and was going to have to make a decision. We fast forward 9 months later, and what we're seeing today, unfortunately, is an Iran that is enjoying relaxed sanctions enforcement, no censure resolutions at the IAEA. They've decided to stack a cabinet with people who are wanted by Interpol and under sanctions for horrible crimes against humanity and terrorism. And all of that has not deterred the United States from simply saying we want to go back to an expiring nuclear deal. And so if I was Iran, I would do the same thing, ratchet up the nuclear program, see how long you can get away with this, and even perhaps drive up the price to sit down and talk in Vienna, which they've alluded to with this $10 billion.
But we do see, or we heard reportedly, the Biden administration turning to China to try to get it to reduce its purchase of Iranian oil as maybe a means of ratcheting up the pressure. So do you not see a potential for the U.S. to looking for other avenues in order to tighten sanctions?
I think it's possible to tighten sanctions, and I think if you wanted to tighten sanctions, especially on oil shipments to China, you would do it. You would threaten state-owned enterprises that might be complicit in some of these illicit cargoes. We have not seen that done by the Biden administration to date. When you can't even bring yourself to have a non-binding resolution of the International Atomic Energy Agency to simply call out Iran for denying inspectors access to sites or to answer questions about undeclared nuclear material, not even talking about the sanctions realm, you're really already on your own 1 yard line with Iran backing you up for no apparent reason. So I do think we need to be very clear-eyed about where the administration's at. They are very, very clear intention to go back to the JCPOA. There's no deadline set for these negotiations to resume. There's no deadline of when these other avenues would be explored. There's no definition of what these other avenues are. So I'm very skeptical that that's not just a political throwaway line.
All right. Well, we do see, though, the Israel National Security Advisor, Eyal Hulata, in Washington for a face-to-face with Jake Sullivan. Is there anything that Israel, on his part, can do to try to make that case a little more convincing and try to nudge the Biden administration, at the very least, to some of the avenues that you're discussing?
Well, first, it's important that there is a conversation and a dialogue. That's something that was missing, obviously, in the second term of the Obama administration. I participated in these dialogues during the Trump administration at the National Security Council. To say that the level of cooperation and dialogue between the U.S. and Israel was at the highest levels in history would be still an understatement, just going back to the maximum pressure campaign. So clearly something valuable for our relationship to have a conversation and have the national security advisors meet. The question is, though, are we mistaking process for progress and communication or talking for actual listening? The Israeli delegation might be bringing ideas and messages that the White House will sit there and listen to. But if you look at the reporting around the expectations of what was going to be achieved in this meeting, all you see is a level setting of the intelligence assessment between the United States and Israel on Iran's nuclear program and its breakout timeline. That's something the Mossad and the CIA could do in their own time. You don't need the National Security Advisor to come to Washington to discuss the intelligence assessment of Iran's nuclear program. To me, these are policymakers. They should be discussing policy coordination. There should be a policy outcome from a meeting at this high level. If the only outcome is that the Israelis delivered messages and they aligned on the intelligence assessment of Iran's nuclear program, this to me seems like a meeting for show, not a meeting for true progress.
Now, there are mixed signals, Richard, coming out of Iran about these talks. I mentioned this call by Tehran to unfreeze $10 billion funds, but we heard another foreign ministry spokesperson say that Iran's basically agreed to go back to the talks even as early as next month. Do you anticipate the talks will resume in Vienna before the end of this year?
I do. I think the Iranians have an incentive to keep this game going. They're probably starting to hear from the Europeans and others that, listen, you have to go back to the table. You have to show something. You're not going to get the $10 billion unfrozen. Not that they really need it unfrozen. They just wanted to see how much more they can get. They've already had relaxations. They've had access to billions of dollars of their oil revenues to repay debts in Asia. We've seen a waiver issued by this administration for that. So I do assume that they want to go back. They want to see how far they can stretch their nuclear program, how far they can stretch sanctions relief. And ultimately, they evade sanctions and keep their enrichment going if they come back to Vienna and keep these talks going for months more.
Right. The enrichment is still going on, and that is the key issue, of course, as we look at how things are developing here. Richard Goldberg at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thanks for joining us.